So, it's been a while since my last update. There's good reasons for that, and I might even make some videos about that. But between the pandemic and other projects that I've kind of had in the fire more or less for a little while now, I decided to go in some different directions and pursue things that were a little more accessible than model railroading, given the state of my local hobby shop and other suppliers in other areas that may or may not have had to deal with more restrictions than we have here in Colorado. So anyway, we'll talk a little bit about what I did to my railroad. The pause in development or progress on the railroad actually gave me a chance to do a serious redesign, and I'm very glad that I did. So let's go take a look at that, and then we'll wrap the video up. Alright. So we can see in this first picture, this is more or less how the yard was starting. As soon as I finished a section of bench work, I started putting the track down, and ultimately that would lead to sticking to some bad decisions because I was already invested in what I had done. In the case of this latest section you see here, the track was all laid, it was all wired in, and then I'm like, maybe this bench work isn't the best. Oh well, too late, we're committed now. It's not the way to do things. Moving on from that, you can see the track arrangement is kind of messy. I know sometimes we like to think that, well, it looks like a prototype yard because the tracks are confusing. No, there should be a rhyme or reason or both for why things look the way they do and why they're set up the way they are. And if you're not doing that, you're probably making a mistake. At least that's my viewpoint on it. Looking down the yard towards the towards the north, you can see that, curves don't necessarily flow. Things just look very haphazard. And where those boxcars are sitting on the right, or kind of in the middle of the picture there, those were supposed to be the arrival departure tracks. And you can see that's basically constitutes a 3-track yard with tied to the main line. A pretty smooth tie to the main line. And then immediately to the left of that is the first tracks of the locomotive shop, with the lead kind of peeling off to the left there to get towards the turntable. So all of this is entirely too small, way too overcompressed for the way that Rice Yard was laid out. You can also see the beginnings of a yard ladder all the way off to the right there, and there's a turnout coming off of that, coming back towards the camera that then splits into 2 tracks. That was the result of kind of using whatever I had on hand, and it just wasn't faithful to the prototype to the best that I can tell, and just not very well laid. Another thing that I had committed to as I was building this thing was building the diesel inspection pit that was kind of off to the kind of on the south by southwest side of the turntable and roundhouse area. And it's a valiant effort, but there's a lot wrong with it. Mostly because it's running parallel to everything, whereas the prototype actually hit that at an angle. There's only a couple of tracks there, and it's not tremendously long. I think the prototype you could squeeze a set of F units onto it, an ABBA set. In this case, I got a couple SD40s sitting on it. And then if you see the V, the kind of angle that's created there, where that can of spray paint and the little green boxes are, that's where everything else is supposed to go, including the big concrete sanding tower, the fuel tanks. There's all kinds of stuff, and it would fit in there, but it's not ideal. And that empty track right there through the middle, there's actually supposed to be 2 in that spot, because the one closest to the sand tower and the fuel tanks is usually populated with cars supplying said sand and fuel to those tanks, not holding locomotives, so I was reducing my capacity by at least 1 track. So overall, a valiant attempt. And then there's the question of that bench work. My apologies to anybody who thought that my ideas in alternative table making were good. Hopefully I don't have that much influence in the hobby right now, because ultimately I ended up scrapping that idea, at least as far as supporting a yard with this much track work and that many joints going across. yeah, I was trying to save weight, but it really wasn't stable enough that I would be confident in its ability to move from place to place within the context of Fremo. So speaking of those tables, I decided to completely reshape, redesign that entire section, both in terms of the track plan and the benchwork. So you can see the module that's holding the drill and those little screw boxes and everything. That's the largest of the modules. It really is a beast. On its extreme edges, it's bigger than a 4x8 sheet of plywood, but because of the angles, it's actually able to twist its way through doorways and stuff like that. It just weighs a lot. And I tried to do what I could to save as much weight as possible by only using plywood where track needed to be supported. All the other empty spaces are filled with foam. So it's kind of back to more traditional hybrid and lumber construction. I figure I'd rather have the weight in exchange for reliability. So, and also you'll see that there's some unconventional angles there. There's actually kind of a three-way joint right there in the middle, and that was basically so that I didn't have to try and align tracks across an angle if I could avoid it. And then I filled in everything with foam, as you can see here. You can see that I got this one piece right here. You can see it's kind of floating. Eventually I injected some more foam underneath there between that stringer and the bottom of the foam, because I actually leaned up against that piece and accidentally popped it out. So it's all reinforced now. And then I used some more foam to kind of fill in where that three-way joint meets. And it's ultimately not perfect, but it's workable. So now we look and see how I changed the track plan. You can now see everything is a lot more cleanly laid. The groupings of tracks are much more distinct. You can see two distinct fans of yard tracks. The one on the right going from 6 tracks to 7 tracks now, as opposed to the prototype's 8 tracks. So we're getting really close to full scale here, hence the name of this video. And off of that fan you can see a track that kind of curves broadly out to the left and then back to the right again. That, I don't know why it was done that way. This is the trouble with the yard having been gone so long, and anybody who ever worked there probably being largely gone as well. But for whatever reason, that track carried over into the first track of the yard to its left, along with those 2 short tracks where the boxcars and the gondola are sitting. So, don't know why it was that way. I've come up with my own little operating scheme. I might describe that in greater detail later. But the other thing that I noticed about this, based on prototype pictures and stuff like that, was that this fan of tracks on the right that I was calling the classification yard is probably more likely the northbound yard. And if you look at it, trains that were headed north to Longmont, Golden, Boulder, Cheyenne, so on and so forth, they would come in off the joint line, hit that yard in one way or another, get pulled apart there, reclassified, and then sent on their merry way. And the fan of tracks to the left were southbound tracks, basically all of those northbound trains, all picking their respective track to ultimately go to Pueblo or La Junta. And then you can see to the left there's 4 tracks there and divided into 2 pairs. Those are the roundhouse tracks. You can see a switch, a left-handed switch just beyond the end of that. Those are the 2 tracks that lead to the diesel pit. And then the 3 tracks all the way to the left are some as yet unexplained auxiliary yard, with that little stub of a track being kind of a foreshortened track that's cut off by the diesel service pit. And as I build that section, which probably won't happen for a little bit, you'll get a better understanding of how those tracks were laid out. I wish I had more prototype photos that weren't in a book, but they're in a book, so I can't really use them here. The other thing you can see here is I moved that double slip switch from connecting to some fantastic east side line, which, as far as I can tell, didn't exist by this time. However, it does do a yeoman's job of connecting the throat of that auxiliary yard to the station tracks and giving the locomotives a nice clean path either directly to the southbound lead or over to the station tracks where they can stand by, pick up their crews, get ready to be stuck onto their train, so on and so forth, or however they did it. There's an awful lot I have to assume about the operation of this yard. And then looking at the throat here towards the west, I guess north or west. I mean, this is a 90-degree yard. But you can see there's 3 tracks to the left. Those are the station tracks. Those are the ones that I had to modify a little bit to fit the new track plan. Otherwise, everything stayed pretty much the same. The leftmost track is the southbound lead. The next one to the right of it is the northbound lead. And a little crossover there, kind of to slip things by without having to go all the way to the end of the plan. I don't know if that's actually what it was for, but it's there on the prototype, so it's there on my model. And this is this shot right here shows how those 3 short lines kind of connect into the first track of the southbound yard. Again, I have no idea why, but they're there, so here they are in my model. And then the track all the way to the right is the service track. So that's a nice clean outer track that the engines can use to get to either end of the yard from the service facility, and also provides access to the caboose track. Or at least, cabooses were being held at the north end over by the shop and the repair and place tracks. And all of this, what you're seeing right now, is on a module that's 30 inches wide. So that leaves at least another 30 inches to model the shop tracks before we start exceeding that 5-foot width limit in terms of people being able to reach it. So the last thing I want to talk about is the orientation of the passenger main line. And one thing that was a problem in the old design was that the passenger main line, the Union Station lead, was coming too close to the edge of the benchwork, both for my own personal liking and according to Fremo rules, where you cannot have a track any closer to the edge of the benchwork than 4 inches. And in some cases I had spots where it was as close as 2 inches from the edge of the benchwork on the inside of a curve, on the track that's supposed to be carrying your passenger trains, which no doubt are more expensive, into Union Station. Across dodgy benchwork with dodgy track work. I just don't know of any run chief that would allow that kind of nonsense into their Fremo setup. So if I want this thing to play well with others, then I had to make some design changes. So what I did with the passenger lead was I did just as the prototype did. I actually peeled it off a good, I think it's about a city block early, away from the rest of the yard body, because the Denver Gas Works used to be in the way. And even though by my time period the gas works isn't there anymore, the tracks still maintained their orientation. And in fact, the BNSF, the joint line main lines that go through Denver still go through that spot more or less on that alignment. So it's only the railroad yard that got scraped and replaced with Elitch Gardens. I did the same thing as the prototype. I peeled that main line off early, putting it on its own 2-foot wide Fremo end, so that that could actually be the termination point. I could just have a unusual 2-to-1 Fremo mainline set up with a bunch of extra stuff tacked onto it representing a rail yard, if that was ever called for. Ultimately, it's supposed to resolve into another 2-track setup, but in any event, it gives a nice 2-foot wide space for the tracks to run right down the middle, thus ensuring the safety of your highly expensive all-brass passenger special. And it also leaves a nice 2-foot little pop-up in between the yard body tracks and that station lead section. So if you need to get in there, re-rail a car, uncouple something, whatever needs to be done. Generally, in terms of yard operations, you shouldn't have to use it, but it's there just in case, and it's a nice just in case to have when you've got a rail yard taking up that much real estate. But otherwise, the design allows for switching and stuff like that to generally be done from the outer fringes of the table. I didn't necessarily plan it that way, but it ended up that way, that all of the switches and throws and everything are really easy to get to. So anyway, that's a look at the yard as it stands now. and hopefully I can get enough of this done that I can get the other end of it started before I have to move, and that way whatever I'm doing won't involve a lot of cutting and making noise and sawdust. So anyway, that's the layout update for now. Thanks for watching. Alright, so that's the state of the railroad. The other thing I'm going to do, probably talk a little bit about some of the other things that I did that kept me from working on the railroad. Kind of a what I did this summer. I don't know if I'll make one big video out of that or make separate videos, because they cover like 3 different topics: construction, computers, and a set of drums. So anyway, that's it for now. See you on the next video. Thanks for coming out.